For 40 years, the personal computing industry operated on one unquestioned assumption, repeated so often by so many people that almost nobody ever stopped to check whether it was actually true. You need Windows. Not Windows is a good choice, not Windows is the most popular option. You need it. Full stop, the way you need electricity or running water, an unavoidable prerequisite for using a computer at all. That assumption sold hundreds of millions of PCs, built one of the largest companies in the history of the world, and shaped how an entire planet learned to think about what a computer even is. It was never actually true. And this year, a tiny laptop company out of Colorado just made that harder to ignore than it's ever been. Let's talk about where the "you need Windows" idea actually came from, because it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't purely a reflection of Windows being the only technically viable option. It was built deliberately over decades through a combination of genuinely excellent software, aggressive business tactics, and a marketing machine that spent 40 years reinforcing one simple message. Computing and Windows are the same thing. Through the 1990s, as the IBM-compatible PC became the standard hardware platform for the entire industry, Microsoft made sure Windows was the software layer sitting on top of nearly all of it, through licensing deals with manufacturers that made shipping a PC without Windows commercially difficult, and through relentless competition against rival operating systems that mostly ended the same way, Windows absorbing the market. By the time Windows 95 launched, with lines of customers waiting outside stores at midnight, the idea that a computer and a computer running Windows were basically interchangeable had settled into the popular imagination so completely that questioning it seemed almost nonsensical, the way questioning whether a car needs wheels would. That success didn't happen purely on merit either, which is worth being direct about, because it's part of why lie is a fair word to use here, rather than just outdated assumption. In the late 1990s, the US government pursued a major antitrust case against Microsoft, centered on allegations that the company had used its dominant market position to squeeze out competing software, most famously by bundling Internet Explorer directly into Windows in a way that made it genuinely difficult for rival browsers to gain a foothold, regardless of their actual quality. The case resulted in real legal consequences and years of ongoing oversight of Microsoft's business practices. That history matters enormously here, because it means the "you need Windows" idea wasn't simply a natural conclusion reasonable people arrived at independently. It was, in real and legally documented ways, actively defended and reinforced through business practices serious enough to draw government intervention. A belief that requires that much active defense to sustain was never quite the self-evident truth it was marketed as. It's worth digging a little deeper into exactly how that message got reinforced year after year, because it wasn't just antitrust-level business tactics. It was also woven into the ordinary, everyday experience of buying and using a computer. For decades, walking into any major electronics retailer meant walking into a room where functionally every single computer on the shelf ran Windows, with no meaningful side-by-side alternative for a typical shopper to even compare against. Software boxes on store shelves listed Windows as a system requirement, as a matter of routine, often without any equivalent Linux option even being considered worth mentioning. IT training programs, corporate onboarding, computer literacy classes in schools, nearly all of it was built around Windows as the unstated default, not because instructors were being deliberately deceptive, but because the assumption had become so deeply embedded that it no longer felt like an assumption at all. It felt like a fact about the world. That's precisely how a marketing message outlives its original justification, not through active ongoing deception, but through decades of institutional momentum that keeps repeating the same message long after the underlying reality has started to shift. There's a useful psychological point buried in why this specific claim proved so durable, and it's worth naming directly. People generally don't go looking for evidence against beliefs they've never had reason to question. If you've used Windows your entire life, if every computer you've ever owned came with it pre-installed, if every piece of software you've ever needed was designed with Windows as the assumed target, you have very little natural incentive to go searching for a counterexample. The claim doesn't need active reinforcement to survive under those conditions. It just needs nobody to bump into contrary evidence by accident. That's exactly what's changed this year. Windows 10's forced end-of-support deadline, hardware requirements that locked out working machines, and companies like System 76 shipping genuinely premium mainstream competitive hardware have all, in their own ways, put contrary evidence directly in front of people who otherwise never would have gone looking for it. It's worth walking through exactly how thoroughly that claim got baked into the ordinary experience of buying and learning to use a computer, because the reinforcement wasn't limited to boardroom-level licensing deals. It touched nearly every part of daily life around computing for decades. Walk into almost any major electronics retailer during the 1990s, 2000s, or even much of the 2010s, and you'd find a room where functionally every computer on the shelf ran Windows, with no meaningful side-by-side alternative for a typical shopper to even compare against. Software boxes listed Windows as a system requirement as a matter of routine, often without any equivalent Linux option even being considered worth mentioning on the packaging. Computer literacy classes in schools, corporate IT onboarding programs, even basic troubleshooting guides handed out by internet service providers were built around Windows as the unstated default. None of that required an active, ongoing conspiracy to sustain. It required only that the assumption, once established, never got seriously challenged in the places where ordinary people actually encountered computers for the first time, which, for most of 4 decades, it simply didn't. That same reinforcement extended into the professional world, too, in ways that made the claim feel even more unassailable to anyone. Building a career around computers, corporate IT departments standardized almost universally on Windows, not necessarily because they'd run rigorous comparisons against alternatives, but because doing anything else meant swimming against an entire industry's default assumptions. Hiring practices built around Windows-specific certifications, enterprise software built and tested primarily for Windows environments, and IT support staff trained almost exclusively on Windows troubleshooting. Choosing anything else wasn't just a technical decision, it was an organizational risk because it meant stepping outside of decades of accumulated institutional muscle memory. That's a genuinely different and genuinely stronger kind of reinforcement than simple marketing repetition. It's the kind of momentum that keeps a claim functioning as accepted truth long after the specific technical justifications underneath it have started to erode. So what's the actual lie, stated plainly? It's the implied claim, repeated for 4 decades through pricing, licensing, marketing, and default behavior, that using a computer productively, running real software, doing real professional work, gaming at a serious level, building genuinely excellent hardware, requires Windows specifically, as opposed to being merely one option among several that happen to dominate through a combination of real strengths and aggressive business tactics. That's the claim this video's title is calling a lie. And it's exactly the claim a small employee-owned hardware company has spent 20 years quietly, methodically disproving one shipped laptop at a time. We're talking about System 76, and if you've never heard of them, that's kind of the point of this video. They're not a household name the way Dell or HP or Lenovo is, but this year, in 2026, they just shipped one of the most impressive laptop refreshes of the entire year. And there is not a single line of Windows anywhere in the box. Let's get into what actually happened, because the specs here are the whole point. This isn't a company making do with underpowered hardware because it can't compete on Windows turf. System 76 just refreshed their Lemur Pro laptop line with Intel's brand new Core Ultra Series 3 Panther Lake processors. The same cutting-edge chip generation flagship Windows laptops are racing to ship this year. The new Lemur Pro comes in both 14-inch and 16-inch configurations, weighs under 3 pounds, and delivers what System 76 is calling the longest battery life of any laptop they've ever built, up to 18 hours on a single charge. It supports up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, up to 4 terabytes of storage, Thunderbolt 4, and Wi-Fi 7. Starting prices went are $999, climbing to just under $2,300 for the flagship configuration. On pure spec sheet terms, this is a premium top-tier ultra-portable, fully competitive with anything Windows-based shipping in the same price range this year. And it's not an isolated product. In that same stretch of 2026, System 76 also refreshed their Adder Pro line with a genuinely striking 2K OLED display in a magnesium aluminum chassis, and updated their Serval WS workstation with Intel's Core Ultra Series 2 processors for people doing serious professional compute work. This is a company actively iterating across an entire lineup at the same pace and with the same seriousness as any major PC manufacturer you'd find at a big box electronics store. Except every single one of these machines ships with 0 Windows license, 0 Windows installer, and 0 Windows anywhere in the software stack. If the 40-year claim were actually true, none of this should be commercially possible. And yet, here it is, shipping, being sold at full premium price to real paying customers year after year. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely damaging to the old claim, rather than just an interesting footnote. System 76 doesn't just sell you generic hardware with a copy of Ubuntu slapped on top and call it a day. They've spent years building their own actual desktop environment called Cosmic, written from the ground up specifically for their machines, and now available more broadly across the Linux ecosystem. Building a custom desktop environment is not a small undertaking. It means designing and maintaining the window manager, the settings panels, the file browser, The notification system, the app launcher, and dozens of other small pieces of software most computer users never think about individually, but rely on constantly. System 76 went further still, rewriting core parts of that desktop experience in Rust, a modern, security-focused programming language, specifically to make it fast, stable, and genuinely polished rather than a rough afterthought. That's not the behavior of a company hedging its bets in case Linux doesn't work out. It's the behavior of a company that decided years ago that the old claim was false and has been quietly building the proof ever since. To be fair, and it's important to be fair here, System 76 alone isn't proof that the entire 40-year claim collapses overnight. Windows still runs on the overwhelming majority of desktop and laptop computers worldwide. And that isn't about to change because of a single premium laptop refresh, however impressive the specs. System 76 operates in a genuine niche. Enthusiasts, developers, open source professionals, people who specifically want a machine built around Linux from the ground up rather than one that merely tolerates it. That audience, while growing, is still a fraction of the overall market. Calling this the end of Windows would be exactly the kind of empty hype this channel tries to avoid. But here's why the niche label doesn't actually let the old claim off the hook. A claim doesn't have to be believed by a majority of people to be false. It just has to be shown false by a credible counterexample. And credibility is exactly what System 76 has built over 2 decades of consistent professional-grade shipping. Every single person who's ever been told that Windows is simply unavoidable, that professional-grade software, serious hardware compatibility, and genuine performance all require Microsoft's operating system sitting somewhere. Underneath them, now has a real physical shipping counterexample sitting on store shelves right now. And this isn't happening in isolation. Millions of Windows 10 users have already been forced to confront the question of whether they actually need Windows, following last October's end-of-support deadline. Governments in Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland have been actively building their entire public sector computing infrastructure around Linux instead of Microsoft's ecosystem. Each one of these, on its own, might look like an edge case. Together, they read like a pattern of the old, claim quietly failing every honest test thrown at it. There's also a generational dimension to this that's worth naming directly, because it explains why the old claim is unlikely to fully recover even once the current news cycle moves on. People who grew up with Windows as the unquestioned default absorbed an entire mental model of computing built around that assumption. Younger users entering the workforce today have a meaningfully different relationship with it. Many of them grew up using Chromebooks in school, which run a Linux-based operating system without that fact ever being prominently advertised, and increasingly do serious computing work through browser-based tools and cloud services that genuinely don't care what operating system sits underneath them. For a growing share of new computer users, you need Windows was never something they personally experienced as an inevitable truth in the first place. It's simply one claim among several they've encountered with no automatic authority behind it, just because it used to be repeated so often. That's exactly the kind of generational shift that tends to compound over time rather than reverse. If you're wondering why this particular exposure feels different from every other Linux might finally break through prediction that's circulated for the past 20 years without much actually changing, it comes down to the difference between hope and evidence. Predictions about Linux's desktop breakthrough have historically leaned on enthusiasm. Genuine, well-intentioned, but ultimately speculative. What's different this year is that the counterexamples aren't speculative anymore. System 76 isn't a promise about what Linux hardware could someday become. It's 20 years of shipped, sold, profitable proof that it already is exactly that, right now, at flagship pricing, to a discerning professional customer base that keeps coming back. It's worth being specific about what the government side of this trend actually involves too, because it adds real institutional weight, not just enthusiast anecdotes. Germany has spent recent years migrating tens of thousands of official government workstations away from Microsoft software and toward Linux and LibreOffice, with the explicit goal of reducing dependency on any single foreign technology vendor. Denmark has run a parallel initiative across its own public sector. Switzerland went further still, passing legislation requiring publicly funded software development to default to open source licensing alongside investment in a sovereign national cloud infrastructure built independently of the big American tech platforms. Governments don't run experiments like this on a whim. These are large, budget-backed, multi-year commitments, each one implicitly agreeing with exactly the premise System 76 has been demonstrating commercially, that a fully functional, professional, government-grade computing environment does not require Windows anywhere in its foundation. It's worth situating System 76 within a broader shift happening across the entire Linux hardware landscape this year too, because they're no longer quite as alone as they used to be, and that matters for how durable this trend is likely to be. Dell has continued selling its XPS line with Ubuntu pre-installed as an official configuration option, not a hobbyist workaround. Lenovo has expanded official Linux certification and support across parts of its ThinkPad lineup, a brand historically associated almost entirely with corporate Windows deployments. Framework, the increasingly popular modular and repairable laptop maker, ships Linux as a fully supported first-class option across its product range, treating it with the same seriousness as Windows, rather than as an afterthought. None of these companies are abandoning Windows as their primary business, but the fact that Linux first and Linux-supported hardware has gone from something you had to hunt for on a forum to something major manufacturers actively market and sell tells you the old claim isn't just being disproven by one small outlier. It's being quietly abandoned piece by piece across an increasingly wide swath of the industry that used to take it for granted. It's worth remembering how genuinely difficult this used to be, because it's part of why the old claim held up for so long, even after it stopped being technically accurate. For most of Linux's history on the desktop, one of the single biggest practical obstacles wasn't the operating system's software itself. It was hardware compatibility, Wi-Fi cards without working drivers, trackpads that registered clicks incorrectly, graphics chips that ran without proper acceleration, or wouldn't wake up correctly from sleep. For a long stretch of time, dismissing Linux as impractical for anyone who wasn't willing to spend a weekend troubleshooting drivers was a genuinely fair criticism, not just corporate propaganda. System 76's entire founding premise was to solve that specific problem head-on. Build and sell hardware where every single component is chosen and configured specifically to work flawlessly with Linux, rather than hoping generic Windows-oriented hardware happens to cooperate. That deliberate 20-year engineering effort is exactly what turned Windows is necessary, from a defensible practical observation into an outdated claim that no longer matches reality. The lie this video's title is talking about isn't that Microsoft invented a falsehood from nothing. It's that the claim kept being repeated and relied upon long after the facts underneath it had quietly changed. There's a genuinely interesting business lesson buried in System 76's 20-year survival story too, and it directly undercuts a specific argument that's been used to prop up the old claim for decades. The idea that nobody would actually pay a real premium price for a computer that doesn't run Windows, that Linux only survives as a bargain bin, budget alternative for people. Cutting corners. System 76's pricing sits squarely in flagship territory. $2,000 and up, not a discount machine positioned as cheap because it's missing Windows. Customers are paying full premium price, specifically because they want the hardware quality and the Linux native software experience together, not because they're settling for something lesser to save money. That's a meaningfully different business model than Linux as the budget option. And it's exactly the model that proves genuine, sustained customer demand exists for premium computing entirely outside Microsoft's ecosystem. It's also worth noting who's actually buying these machines, because the customer base itself is evidence against the old claim. System 76's audience skews heavily toward developers, system administrators, data scientists, and other technically sophisticated professionals. Exactly the kind of buyers with the most reason to be price sensitive about wasted licensing costs, and the most technical knowledge to genuinely evaluate whether an alternative to Windows can actually hold up under serious daily use. These aren't casual buyers picking Linux because it sounded interesting in a video. They're professionals whose actual livelihood depends on their machine working reliably, running demanding software, and not getting in their way. The fact that this specific discerning audience keeps coming back to System 76 year after year, paying full premium price the entire time, is about as strong a real-world refutation of "you need Windows" as this industry has produced. So what does exposed actually mean in the context of this video's title, since it's worth being precise rather than hyperbolic about the claim? It doesn't mean Windows is disappearing, or that Microsoft's revenue is collapsing, or that most people are about to abandon Windows en masse next year. What it means is narrower, and in some ways more. Significant for a claim that's been repeated, largely unchallenged, for 40 years, the specific cultural belief that Windows is simply unavoidable, the default nobody seriously questions, the water that computing fish don't even notice they're swimming in, is the thing that's finally being tested in public, visibly, by a credible, sustained, 20-year counterexample rather than a scattered handful of enthusiast anecdotes easy to dismiss. Once a large enough population of people has directly seen, whether through a company like SystemBox, a government migration in Europe, or their own frustrated experience with Windows 11's hardware requirements, that a genuinely excellent computing experience is possible without Windows anywhere in the picture, the old claim stops functioning as an unquestioned truth and starts looking like exactly what it always was, a marketing message that happened to be reinforced by real market dominance for a very long time, but was never actually a technical necessity. There's one more piece of the old claim worth addressing directly, because it was historically the single strongest argument in its favor, and its collapse this year deserves specific attention: gaming. For as long as most people can remember, you need Windows carried an unspoken but very real asterisk. You need Windows, especially if you ever want to play modern video games, because gaming on Linux was genuinely, legitimately impractical for the average person. That asterisk has quietly disappeared. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, combined with the runaway success of the Steam Deck, has made Linux gaming a real, mainstream viable option, rather than a compromise reserved for a handful of dedicated enthusiasts willing to fight with configuration files. Steam's own hardware survey has repeatedly shown Linux gaming share climbing well past levels that would have sounded implausible just 5 years ago. That matters enormously for this specific story because gaming was arguably the last remaining pillar propping up the old claim for a huge segment of everyday computer users, who otherwise had no strong technical reason to stay tied to Windows. Once that pillar weakens, the rest of the claim has a lot less holding it up. Put all of these pieces together. The antitrust history showing the claim was actively defended rather than simply true, the retail and institutional momentum that kept it unquestioned for decades, the psychological reality that people rarely go looking for evidence against beliefs they've never had reason to doubt, and the recent collapse of gaming as the claim's last strong pillar, and you get a much fuller picture of exactly why System 76's 20-year track record lands as genuine exposure rather than just another niche hardware story. It isn't one company embarrassing Microsoft in isolation. It's the last remaining structural support underneath a 40-year-old claim finally buckling. At the exact moment, several completely independent pressures, Windows 10's end-of-support deadline, European government migrations, and a maturing Linux hardware ecosystem are all converging on the same conclusion at once. And it's worth remembering, before you go, exactly what makes this different from just another company review video. This isn't really about whether one specific laptop is good, although it clearly is. It's about a 40-year-old claim finally running out of places to hide. Every year that System 76 keeps shipping, every government that keeps migrating, every Windows 10 user forced to reconsider their assumptions by a hardware deadline they never asked for, chips away a little more at a message that used to be simply accepted without question. None of it happens through a single dramatic moment. It happens exactly the way this video's title suggests. Quietly, steadily, one exposed gap at a time, until enough people have seen the evidence that the old claim stops being able to hide behind decades of unexamined repetition. If you want to see the full picture of why so many people are questioning the "you need Windows" claim in the first place this year, I've got the full breakdown of the Windows 10 migration wave linked right here, along with the other stories we've covered about Microsoft's own products quietly underserving Linux users at every turn. The Teams lockout, the secure boot certificate mess, Copilot's broken sidebar on Edge for Linux. Taken together, they paint a much clearer picture of exactly how a 40-year-old claim starts quietly falling apart than any single story does on its own. Subscribe if you want to keep watching exactly how much of that old claim keeps getting tested and keeps not holding up.